In the cold, coal-dusted hollows of 1930s West Virginia, a ghost walked the mountains. They called him Little Billy Rhodes. He was a thief who never took for himself, a phantom who left sacks of flour on the doorsteps of starving miners' shacks. Then, one day, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. No body, no trial, no final shootout. Just silence. The company bosses called him a dangerous criminal. The law called him a menace. But to the families trapped in the crushing grip of debt and desperation, he was something else entirely. A prayer answered in the dead of night. Was he a real man of flesh and blood? Or was he an idea, a spirit of defiance that lived in the hearts of a whole community? Today, we dig through a mountain of legend to find the truth, to understand how the quiet anger of 1,000 miners gave birth to the Ballad of Little Billy Rhodes. To find the man, you have to dig past the myth, and the story they tell always begins in the same place. A grey, clapboard house in a nameless company town, indistinguishable from 100 others pressed into the folds of the West Virginia hills. It's a place where the air itself tastes of coal dust, and the only clock that matters is the steam whistle from the tipple. This wasn't a community, it was a holding pen, built for the sole purpose of extracting coal from the earth and loyalty from the men who mined it. They say Billy was born into a miner's family, like every other boy in the camp. His father was a man whose strength was legendary, able to load more tons in a shift than any two younger men, but who came home each night with a little more of the mountain ground into his lungs. His mother was a woman who could make a meal from next to nothing and find a way to patch a patch, her silence a testament to a resilience that ran deeper than any coal seam. In that small shack, he learned the unspoken code of the mountains. You protect your own, you owe no debt to an outsider who disrespects you, and you never, ever show weakness. The world outside that door, however, operated on a different code entirely. The turning point, the moment the boy became something more, came with the sound of a cough. It was his father's cough, a wet, ragged sound that signaled the end. Black lung. The company called it miner's asthma and docked his pay for missed shifts. When he finally succumbed, the company sent no condolences. They sent a man with a ledger to calculate the family's outstanding debt at the company store. The man who had given his life to the mine was now just a negative number in a book. The true breaking point came a week later. Billy, still a boy, but now the man of the house, watched his mother stand before the company store manager, a man with a soft belly and clean fingernails. She was pleading for a bag of flour on credit just until her oldest son could start in the mines. The manager checked his ledger, shook his head, and turned her away empty-handed. In that moment, Billy saw it all with a terrifying clarity. The injustice wasn't a mistake in the system, it was the system. He saw his mother's shame, the manager's indifference, and the well-stocked shelves that might as well have been a world away. That night, something in him hardened, turning his grief into a cold, sharp-edged purpose. He didn't cry. He watched. He began to truly see the woods that surrounded the camp, not as a playground, but as a sanctuary, a place with its own laws that the company couldn't touch. He learned the paths the guards walked, the timing of the supply wagons, the way a loose floorboard in the company store sang a different tune than the others. The mountains were teaching him, forging him. He was creating his own code, born from the ashes of his father's life. It was a simple code, but absolute. You do not harm a working man. You do not touch a family's meager possessions. You do not spill blood if it can be avoided. But you take back what was stolen, you humble the proud, and you deliver justice where the law refuses to tread. The boy who watched his mother walk away with nothing was gone. In his place stood a shadow, waiting for the right moment to fall. Before the full weight of the law and the focused rage of the coal barons came crashing down, there was a period of strange, tense equilibrium. The name Little Billy Rhodes settled over the hollows, not like a storm cloud, but like the persistent mountain fog, a constant, unseen presence that changed the landscape. He wasn't a man you'd meet at the company store. He was the reason you could walk past that store with your head held a little higher, knowing its power wasn't absolute. In those days, his legend was written on the porches of the needy. A family whose father was too sick to work would wake to find a side of bacon and a sack of potatoes by the door, left sometime between the last patrol of the company guards and the first light of dawn. A widow, facing eviction, might find a handful of real US dollars tucked into the frame of her screen door, just enough to pacify the company man for another month. These weren't grand gestures, they were acts of targeted survival, a quiet redistribution of stolen wages. His relationship with the community was a sacred, unspoken pact. They were his eyes and ears. A child playing by the creek might see a new company guard and mention it to his father. That evening, the information would travel through the camp. A ripple of warning passed in hushed tones between miners at the coalface, between women hanging laundry on the line. In return, the community became a fortress of silence. When the sheriff and his deputies came asking questions, they were met with blank stares, slow shrugs, and the impenetrable wall of mountain folk protecting their own. Little Billy? Can't say I know the man. This was Billy in his prime, a master of his domain. He moved through the world of the company town like a ghost in his own house. He knew which guards drank on duty, which managers were careless with their keys, and which routes the payroll wagon took on the last Friday of the month. He wasn't just a thief, he was an intelligence operative in a war nobody had officially declared. He had turned the mountains that imprisoned his people into his greatest weapon, a labyrinth of shadow and stone where he was king. This fragile balance was the world he had built, a world he sought to protect. It was a place where fear was no longer the only currency, where a single defiant man could hold back the tide of corporate greed. He had given his people more than just food and money. He had given them hope, a dangerous and priceless commodity. And it was this very success, this growing legend, that would eventually become the greatest threat to his existence. But a man who lives by a code is also a predictable man. And little Billy's greatest strength, that unwavering, white-hot sense of justice, was also the one crack in his armor. He wasn't a cold strategist. He was a man fueled by a righteous fire. His heists on company property were calculated, almost impersonal acts of war. But when the cruelty of the system took on a human face, his response became deeply, dangerously personal. The story they tell is of a new mine foreman, a man named Blackwood, who came to the camp with a reputation for breaking unions and a temper as foul as mine drainage. Blackwood wasn't content to simply enforce the rules. He reveled in the humiliation of the miners. One afternoon, he publicly berated an elderly miner, a man who had worked the seams for 40 years, for being too slow, kicking the old man's lunch pail into the mud and mocking him in front of his crew. For Billy Rhodes, this was not a matter of scrip or payroll. This was an intolerable affront to the dignity of his people. The system wasn't just starving them, it was now spitting in their faces. That night, little Billy didn't go to the company store. He slipped past Blackwood's own yard dogs, through the window of his private residence, and into the room where the foreman slept. He stole nothing of value. Instead, he took Blackwood's prized double-barreled shotgun from its rack over the mantel, broke it clean over his knee, and laid the two splintered pieces on the pillow next to the sleeping man's head. To the miners who heard the story whispered the next day, it was a moment of pure triumph. But in truth, it was a grave error. It was the first time Billy had let his anger guide him instead of his reason. He had shown his hand. He had revealed that the way to get to the ghost wasn't to guard the safes, but to wound the community. He had proven that he could be baited, that his fury could be aimed. And in the cold, calculating eyes of the coal company, a man who can be angered is a man who can be trapped. The company, led by the foreman Blackwood, understood its enemy now. Humiliated by the broken shotgun, Blackwood realized that the way to kill a ghost is to attack what it loves. He stopped looking for a man in the shadows and started looking for a lever in the community, a way to force little Billy into the light. And he found that lever in a widow named Sarah, whose husband had been crushed in a rockfall the year before. Sarah and her young son were a symbol of the camp's suffering, and it was widely known that they were among the first to receive the Phantom's nocturnal gifts. The affront, when it came, was an act of calculated theatre. On a cold, drizzly morning, Blackwood and two of his hired guards marched to Sarah's shack. In front of the assembled miners heading to the morning shift, he accused her of consorting with thieves and possessing stolen company property. He wasn't arresting her. He was doing something far more cruel. He was evicting her. The guards began throwing her meager possessions out into the muddy street: a cast-iron skillet, a threadbare quilt, a small stack of books. Her son, no older than 7, ran out to grab his only real toy, a small bird carved from a piece of scrap wood. One of the guards deliberately stepped on it, crushing it under his boot heel. The news of this public humiliation spread through the mine faster than a gas leak. For the miners, it was a profound act of terror, a message that even the most vulnerable were not safe. For little Billy, hearing the story passed in enraged whispers, it was something else entirely. It was a declaration of war aimed directly at his soul. The crushed wooden bird, the woman's silent tears, the foreman's smug satisfaction, these images burned away all his caution and calculation. This was no longer about scrip or safes. The unwritten rules of their conflict had been shattered. Blackwood had crossed a sacred line, targeting the innocent to draw him out. In that moment, Billy's mission changed. The cool-headed strategist vanished, replaced by a man consumed by a cold, singular rage. He saw the face of the system, and it was Blackwood's face. The foreman had taken a silent war and made it deafeningly personal. This was the point of no return. To let this stand would be to admit defeat, to tell the miners that their champion was powerless against true cruelty. It would poison the very hope he had cultivated. A response was no longer a choice. It was an obligation. The trap had been set, the bait had been taken, and little Billy Rhodes began walking a path from which there could be no turning back. The character of the Hollows changed. The whispers about little Billy, once filled with a kind of reverent excitement, were now laced with dread. The older miners, the ones with the deepest scars and longest memories, knew what this kind of escalation meant. They'd seen it before in strikes that ended in bloodshed. An attack on company property was one thing. A direct, personal war with a company man was an invitation for a massacre. They knew that when a hornet's nest is kicked, it isn't just the one who kicked it that gets stung. An old miner, a man who had worked alongside Billy's father, sought him out. He met him not in the camp, but in the deep woods, at a place marked by a lightning-scarred oak. He didn't plead. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had buried too many friends. "It's a trap, son," he said, his voice raspy from a lifetime of coal dust. "Blackwood is goading you. He wants you to come at him. He wants a reason to bring in the guns from Baldwin Felts and turn this camp into a war zone. You do this, and every family here will pay the price for your anger." Others sent messages through the silent network of the community. They urged patience. The unions were getting stronger, they argued. Roosevelt's government was starting to make noise. There were other ways to fight, slower ways that wouldn't get people killed. They were offering him a path of compromise, a chance to let his personal fury cool and melt back into the collective struggle. They were begging their ghost to remain a ghost, not to become a target. But Billy's ears were deaf to caution. From his perspective, their pleas for patience sounded like a quiet acceptance of defeat. How could he wait for a union organizer to arrive next month when a widow and her son were homeless now? His entire existence was built on the principle of immediate, tangible justice. To ignore Blackwood's cruelty would be to break his own code, to betray the very people he was trying to protect. He saw their warnings not as wisdom, but as the fear that had kept them all in chains. His response, passed back to the old miner, was chilling in its finality. He put a woman and her child in the mud, There's no waiting after that. The conversation was over. His actions grew bolder and more personal. He no longer cared about stealth. One night, the two guards Blackwood had used to evict Sarah woke up to find their shotguns missing and a dead black snake coiled on each of their doorsteps, a clear mountain threat. Then he went for Blackwood himself. The foreman came out one morning to find a single pristine bullet sitting on his porch railing, a promise of what was to come. The ghost was no longer content to rob. He was now actively hunting. Each act was another step down a narrowing path, stripping away his anonymity and locking him into a collision course. He was ignoring every outstretched hand, every offered exit, his eyes fixed only on the man who had become the embodiment of all his hatred. The company brought in new guards, hard-faced men from out of state who didn't know the miners' names and didn't care to learn them. They patrolled the camp in pairs, shotguns held at the ready, turning the already tense atmosphere into a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The community that had been Billy's shield was now a prison for its own people, and he was the reason. The weight of that knowledge led him to the one place he could think clearly, a rocky outcrop high above the camp, a crow's nest where he could watch the lights of the shacks below without being seen. It was there she found him, Sarah. The old miner who had warned him must have told her where to look. She didn't approach with fear, but with a weary, heartbreaking resolve. She stood before him, a simple woman in a worn dress, and in the pale moonlight, he could see the profound exhaustion in her eyes. "You have to stop, Billy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This ain't justice. This is just more trouble." She told him how the other women now shied away from her, afraid to be seen as her friend. She told him how Blackwood's men followed her son home from his games by the creek. She explained that his gifts had become a curse, marking her family for persecution. "You wanted to give us hope," she pleaded, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "But all I feel is fear. Every night I pray you don't do anything else in my name. Please, just disappear again. Let us be." For the first time since his father died, the cold certainty in his heart wavered. He looked at her face, and for a moment he saw not a cause, but a person he was breaking in his attempt to save her. Her words were a lifeline, a final off-ramp from the path of violence he was on. He could listen. He could heed the warnings of his own people. He could melt back into the mountains, let the Union men fight the long, slow battle, and allow the wounds to heal. He could let the ghost of little Billy die, and let the man live. But then he looked past her, down at the company town, lit by the cold electric glare of the tipple, and he saw the bars of the cage. He saw Blackwood's house, warm and bright, while Sarah stood before him shivering. The image of the crushed wooden bird flashed in his mind. To stop now, to walk away, felt like a deeper betrayal than any violence he could commit. It would mean that a man like Blackwood could break a child's spirit and pay no price. It would mean the system always wins. He looked back at Sarah, and the conflict in his eyes hardened back into resolve. "If I stop now," he said, his voice low and final, "then he wins. Then they all win. This has to end with him." He had heard the plea of the widow and chosen the path of the bullet. The final crossroads had been passed. The night of the payroll was a night of ritual. The heavy rains came, turning the camp's dirt streets into a river of mud, a perfect curtain of noise and shadow. Inside the company office, a single lamp cast a greasy yellow circle of light. Within that circle sat Blackwood, alone, the stacks of scrip and the few precious stacks of real dollars laid out before him like a king surveying his hoard. He was a man at the peak of his power, secure in his fortress of glass and wood. He did not hear the creak of the floorboards on the porch over the drumming of the rain. When the office door opened, it didn't swing gently. It was kicked inward, the lock splintering with a sharp crack. Blackwood looked up, not in fear, but in pure, undiluted rage. Standing there, framed in the doorway with the storm at his back, was no longer a ghost. It was a man, soaked to the bone, his face pale and set like a death mask. For the first time, the two men were in the same room, the entire conflict of the hollows condensed into the 10 feet of space between them. Blackwood slowly pushed his chair back, a venomous smirk spreading across his face. "So the rat finally comes out of his hole," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Come to see what a real payroll looks like?" He gestured to the money on the desk, a clear and final act of mockery. Billy didn't look at the money. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, never left Blackwood's face. The world outside, the rain, the camp, the entire mountain, it all faded away. The universe had shrunk to the size of this one small, lamplit room. "This is for Sarah." Billy's voice was unnaturally calm, a quiet stone in the heart of the storm. "This is for the bird." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He started to rise, his hand moving toward a drawer in the desk. "That worthless woman, that brat, you threw your life away for—" He never finished the sentence. A flash of brilliant orange light filled the room, so bright and so brief it seemed to steal the very air. It was followed by a sound so immense, so absolute, it was more than a sound, it was a physical blow. The single window pane behind the desk shattered, and the lamp on the desk leapt into the air before crashing down, plunging the room into near darkness. The argument that had raged for a month was suddenly, permanently over. The heavy silence that rushed in to fill the void was broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the tin roof and the frantic metallic spin of a single silver dollar that had been knocked from a stack on the desk. It spun on the floorboards, a tiny, glittering whirlwind in the gloom, before it finally wobbled, fell, and was still. In that deafening quiet, Billy stood in the doorway, the cool rain on his back a stark contrast to the sudden, stifling heat in the room. He could smell the sharp, acrid scent of burnt powder hanging in the air. There was no feeling of victory, no satisfaction. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness. The ghost of little Billy was gone, and in his place stood a man who had just crossed a line from which no one ever returns. For a long moment, Billy did not move. The only sound was the rain, a constant, indifferent witness. The ringing in his ears slowly subsided, replaced by a silence that was heavier than any noise. The fire that had driven him for months, that white-hot core of righteous fury, was gone. In its place was a profound and chilling emptiness, as if the act itself had scoured him clean of all emotion. He looked at the dark shape slumped behind the desk and felt nothing. Not triumph, not remorse, just the dead weight of a line crossed. A distant shout cut through the sound of the storm, followed by the frantic barking of a dog. The world was waking up to the sound of the shot. The spell was broken. He looked at the desk, at the stacks of scrip and cash scattered by the force of the blast. This was the prize, the very currency of the company's power. It was his for the taking. But he didn't move toward it. He realized with a sudden, devastating clarity that it meant nothing to him. It had never been about the money. He turned his back on the office, on the wealth, on the body of his enemy, and stepped back out into the rain. He didn't run. He simply receded, melting back into the storm that had delivered him. He moved with an animal's instinct, his feet finding sure purchase on the muddy paths he knew better than the lines on his own hand. The cold rain was a baptism, washing the smell of cordite from his clothes, but it couldn't wash the feeling from his soul. The mountain, his lifelong sanctuary and accomplice, was now his place of exile. The hollows and ridges that had once been his kingdom were now the walls of his banishment. From a high, hidden place, the same rocky outcrop where Sarah had pleaded with him, he watched the camp below erupt. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies in the dark as men emerged from their shacks, their shouts muffled by the downpour. A crowd was gathering around the company office. He was watching the consequences of his choice unfold, watching his own legend transform from a whisper of hope into a stark and bloody fact. The law would come now, and the company's wrath would be absolute. He had won his personal battle, but in doing so, he had lost his place in the world. The man known as Billy Rhodes was gone. Only the ghost remained, and its work was done. The ghost was gone, but the storm he had called down had only just begun to break over the hollows. Within days, the camp was transformed into an occupied territory. The company brought in a dozen more guards, hard-faced professionals whose only job was to make the miners pay for the sin of defiance. They patrolled the muddy streets with a swaggering authority, their shotguns a constant, silent threat. The camp, once a place of quiet, simmering rebellion, was now gripped by a cold and open fear. The company's revenge was not swift and bloody, it was slow and suffocating. The logic was as simple as it was brutal. If a community could spawn a killer, then the entire community was sick and needed a harsh cure. Credit at the company store was cut off for everyone. The scrip-to-dollar exchange rate was slashed, rendering their meager pay almost worthless. Every privilege, every tiny bit of leeway, was revoked. It was a campaign of collective punishment designed to grind the spirit of the miners into dust, to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The most profound wreckage was left at the feet of the very person Billy had sought to avenge. Sarah became a pariah. To the company, she was the witch who had conjured the devil. Her shack was watched constantly. To her neighbors, consumed by their own new hardships, she was a painful reminder of the trouble, the woman whose name was now tied to a killing. The whispers that had once been of support turned to whispers of blame. The other women would pull their children close when she passed, as if the tragedy were a contagion she carried. The gifts left on her porch had become a curse, just as she had feared. The sacred silence that had once been their shield now became a weapon turned inward. The unified front against the company cracked, splintering into factions of fear and resentment. Men who had once shared a nod of understanding now avoided each other's eyes. Was Billy a hero who went too far, or a fool who had brought this hell down upon them all? The question hung in the coal-dusted air, poisoning the relationships between families, turning a community of brothers into a collection of isolated, frightened individuals. In his quest for a pure, singular act of justice, little Billy had done the one thing his enemies never could. He had broken the spirit of the camp. He had cut the head off the snake, but in its place, 100 smaller serpents of fear, suspicion, and misery had grown. The single shot fired in the company office had not freed them. It had only tightened the chains, and now everyone was paying the price. The law that came to the Hollows was an alien thing. It arrived in polished cars that struggled on the muddy roads, carried by men in clean suits who looked at the mountains not with respect, but with a flat, assessing gaze. A company foreman was dead, and the world outside the camp demanded a resolution. But their target, the man whose name was now spoken only in fearful whispers, was gone. A ghost cannot be put in handcuffs. A legend cannot be put on trial. So the law, prodded by the immense pressure and deep pockets of the coal company, did what systems of power always do when they cannot find a culprit. They created one. Her name was Sarah. The charge was not murder, but a tangle of legal terms that meant little to the miners: conspiracy, aiding and abetting a known fugitive. The trial was moved from the local courthouse to the county seat, a stage deliberately set to intimidate the mountain folk. It was a performance for an audience of one, the Blackwood Coal and Coke Company, who needed to demonstrate that the old code of the Hollows was dead, and their law was now the only law. The trial itself was the very picture of the culture clash. On one side sat the company lawyers, their arguments sharp, precise and cold, twisting the miners' code of silence into a web of conspiracy. Every miner who took the stand and claimed "I don't know" was another thread in the noose they were weaving around Sarah. On the other side, Sarah sat, a bewildered figure of quiet dignity. Her defense was the simple, unadorned truth. She told them about her husband's death, about her son's hunger, about the food that appeared on her porch like a miracle. Her simple truth was like a wooden bucket against a steel dam. It held nothing back. To the miners who packed the courtroom, their faces scrubbed clean but their eyes weary, Sarah was not a criminal. She was a martyr. They watched in stony silence as the life they understood, a life of loyalty, of protecting your own, of accepting help without asking questions, was presented to the jury as a criminal enterprise. They saw the proceedings not as a search for justice, but as the final public humiliation of their community. Their silence was no longer about protecting Billy Rhodes. It was a wall of contempt for the world that was judging them. The verdict, when it came, was a formality. Guilty. The judge, a man who would never understand the desperation of a company town, spoke of the sanctity of law and order as he sentenced her to 10 years in the state penitentiary. There were no gasps from the miners in the gallery. There was no outrage. There was only a deep, collective sigh, the sound of a people having their worst fears confirmed. They had seen the true face of the law, and it looked exactly like the face of the company boss. Was justice served? A court of law had delivered a verdict. A woman was sent to prison. A murder case was officially closed. But in the hollows, they knew the truth. The law hadn't brought justice. It had simply been the final weapon used to crush a rebellion. It had punished the victim to send a message to the ghost, and in doing so, proved that the only real crime in the eyes of the company was to be poor, hungry, and defiant. And what of the other side of this bloody coin? What became of the company that Blackwood served, the machine that had ground so many lives into dust? You might think the death of a foreman would be a blow, a disruption to their operations. But for Blackwood Coal and Coke, it was a godsend. Blackwood was a blunt instrument, and he had served his purpose. He was more valuable to them as a corpse than he ever was as a living man. His death became their martyr story, the perfect justification they presented to the newspapers and politicians for the brutal crackdown that followed. They hadn't lost a man. They had gained a pretext. In the immediate aftermath, the company prospered. With the camp terrified into submission and the last spark of defiance seemingly extinguished with Sarah's conviction, the mine became a model of ruthless efficiency. The new foreman they brought in wasn't a hot-tempered bully like Blackwood. He was a quiet, cold man with spectacles and a ledger, an accountant of human misery who never raised his voice and never had to. Production quotas were met and exceeded. The company store, now without any competition from phantom benefactors, squeezed every last cent from the miners. On paper, in the Charleston and Philadelphia boardrooms, the company had never been stronger. They had won. But a story like this has a way of seeping out of a hollow like a poisonous gas. Men who eventually left the camp carried the tale with them. Union organizers, hearing the whispers, took note. The tale of little Billy and the widow Sarah became a dark ballad sung in secret, a cautionary example of corporate cruelty at its most naked. The name Blackwood Coal and Coke became a stain, a name that would be invoked years later during the larger, bloodier mine wars that would eventually rock all of Appalachia. The company met no immediate justice. Their victory was real, and it was absolute. But in crushing that small camp, they had inadvertently created a legend that would fuel the very movement that would one day challenge their entire empire. They hadn't put out a fire. They had just buried the embers under a layer of dry tinder, waiting for a wind to blow. The years that followed were quiet ones, but it was the quiet of a graveyard, not of peace. Sarah's son grew up an orphan of the coal company's justice. He was taken in by a distant relative, but he was never truly one of them. He was a living ghost in the camp, a quiet, watchful boy whose eyes held the memory of a trauma the town was desperate to forget. The name he carried was as heavy as a seam of slate, a constant, unspoken reminder of the day the ghost walked among them and brought ruin. He learned early to be silent, to expect nothing, and to work. When he was old enough, he went into the same mine that had claimed his father, a final, grim surrender to the system. The community did not rebuild, it scarred over. The names Billy and Sarah were buried under a thick blanket of unspoken agreement. To speak them was to invite bad luck, to pick at a wound that refused to heal. The spirit of open defiance that little Billy had briefly ignited was replaced by a weary, pragmatic obedience. Men loaded their coal, women stretched their scrip, and they kept their heads down. The power of the company was no longer a thing to be challenged. It was a feature of the landscape, as immovable and dangerous as the mountain itself. They had learned the price of a hero, and it was too high. But the story did not die. It seeped out of the hollow and was carried by the men who eventually left for other camps, for other mines. And there, it found fertile ground in the growing union movement. The tale of the widow, the foreman, and the ghost became a recruiting sergeant's sharpest tool. It was told in hushed tones in union halls and secret meetings, a perfect, brutal parable of why they had to fight back, not as individuals, but as one. The blood spilled in that small camp watered the roots of a more organized and far more formidable resistance. Nearly a decade later, a stooped, gray-haired woman stepped off a bus at the edge of the camp. Sarah had come home. But the place she returned to was a stranger's land. Her son was a man now, with coal dust etched into the lines on his face and a silence that mirrored her own. Their reunion was not one of joyful tears, but of a quiet, shared ache for a lifetime of lost years. She lived out her days in the small shack he provided for her, a ghost returned to a place haunted by the memory of what had been lost and what could never be regained. If you drive deep enough into those West Virginia hills today, and you know which forgotten state route to turn off of, you might find the place where the camp once stood. There's nothing there now but ghosts. Kudzu vines choke the life out of old stone foundations, and the rusted skeleton of a coal tipple stands against the sky like the ribs of some long-dead beast. The entrance to the mine is sealed with a slab of concrete, a final grey tombstone for the mountain's heart. The silence is absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling overhead. The company is gone, the houses are gone, the people are gone. But the story remains. It lives on, not in history books, but in the way a story was always meant to live in these mountains, as a ballad. They call it the Ballad of Billy Rhodes, and old men with calloused fingers still pick out the tune on worn-out guitars. The words have changed over the generations, but the core of it is always the same, a story of a stolen bird, a widow's tears, and a single shot that echoed in the rain. It's a ghost story told to children, a cautionary tale about the high cost of anger and the sharp edges of justice. The real monuments to this story aren't the crumbling foundations, but the two simple headstones in a nearby churchyard. One for Sarah and one for her son, who died an old man after a life spent in the mines, his silence as deep as the coal seams he worked. They are the tangible proof of the tragedy. But there is no stone for little Billy. His absence is his true memorial. By never being found, he was never reduced to a simple man of flesh and bone. He remains an idea, a spirit, and his name is still a kind of currency. In parts of those hills, when a new company comes in promising jobs but delivering poison in the water, when the deck feels impossibly stacked against the working man, you can sometimes hear his name invoked in a low murmur. This is the kind of thing that makes a man turn into little Billy. He is no longer a historical figure. He is a symbol of that final, desperate line between endurance and rebellion. The man is long gone, dust in an unmarked mountain grave, or perhaps an old man who died peacefully under a different name 1,000 miles away. But his spirit? It never left the hollow. They say that on nights when the fog hangs thick and low in the valleys, so thick you can't see your own hand in front of your face, you can almost feel him watching from the tree line. He is the whisper on the wind, the shadow that flits at the edge of your vision, the ghost of a name that reminds the world that even in the quietest, most forgotten places, there is a limit to what a man will endure. So we come to the end of the trail, back where we started, with the same question hanging in the air. Was little Billy Rhodes a hero or a villain? The truth, like a mountain stream, is never that clear. He wasn't a hero. A hero saves his people. Billy's righteous fury brought a world of pain down on the very community he bled for, proving that a single act of vengeance can be more destructive than years of quiet suffering. His victory was their catastrophe. But he was no villain. Villains are driven by greed or a lust for power. Billy was driven by a love so fierce it became a fire, and a sense of justice so pure it was blind to the consequences. He was a symptom of a disease, a violent reaction to an unbearable pressure. He was a man who became a monster to fight a monster, and in the end, he was consumed by the battle. In the end, this is a story about the terrible price of a justice that is demanded in a single moment with a single bullet. It's a lesson that individual righteousness, no matter how pure, is a poor weapon against a cold and faceless system. A man's rage can topple a foreman, but it cannot topple a company. All it can do is leave a scar on the land and a ghost in the memory of the people he tried to save. And that, my friends, is the ballad of little Billy Rhodes, a man who loved justice more than anything, but forgot to ask the people he was saving what that justice would cost them.